Today's Google stock analysis is going to look at some problems at Google that may not be apparent to those that aren't following the company very closely. Now, this company doesn't need an introduction. Their search engine is used by practically everybody. They have a 92% market share, maybe upwards of that in search. And search has become such a popular part of culture. This is a great site. It's LMGTFY. It's let me Google that for you, and you can put a search term in there and get a link, and you can send somebody that link, and it teaches them how to Google stuff. And that's for when people ask you questions that they could have just Googled themselves. So in the same way that Xerox became a label for copying something, Google is now a term used to describe looking something up. Now, Google had their IPO back in 2004. That's nearly 20 years ago. At that time, they had a market cap of more than $23 billion, and we invested in the firm at that time because of the potential that they had, the messaging coming from the company about how they wanted to solve the world's biggest problems. They're charismatic leaders, and the question might be, well, if we invested in Google's IPO, why aren't we retired instead of creating YouTube content? And that's a very good question, and it's a good lesson to learn. It's all about needing money to make money. Now, Google's performance has been quite good. So when you look at the performance of a stock, you first need to take into account the performance of a benchmark and then back that out. So from the time of Google's IPO to when I pulled this chart several days ago, the performance has been 3,463%. That sounds great. But first you need to back out the performance of the NASDAQ. In other words, you could have just invested in the NASDAQ and not taken any company-specific risk and realized close to 700%. So we back that out, we get 2,772%. Now, let's look at what sort of transformation might have happened based on how much money you would have had to invest in Google. So back when we invested in the Google IPO, we weren't commanding the sort of money that we have, the sort of assets we have today. So the amount that we put in was much less than what we might invest today. So money is relative to everyone. We never use amounts when we talk about the assets we're managing or what we invest in a particular stock because of the fact that money is relative. But one thing's for sure is that being poor is very expensive. So there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of the great examples is when you look at investing. So up here in the upper left there, that bubble shows if you had $1,000 and you invested it in the Google IPO and then held it until now, you'd have $27,720. Now, the young kids out there might think that's really exciting, but to be honest, that $27,000 just doesn't get you very much. If you invested $2,500, you'd have $69,000. Again, this isn't a life-changing amount. Even $10,000 is only going to give you $277,000. These are not retirement windfalls. $100,000, now you're starting to get somewhere. You'd have a $2.7 million. Okay, but to invest $100,000 responsibly, you'd need to have a portfolio of $2 million to do that, which would represent 5% of your holdings. So the bubble on the lower right shows if you had a certain amount of money, how much you could invest without allocating more than 5% of that total investment pool. So if you have $200,000 and you don't want to invest in a stock more than 5% of your total wealth, then the maximum you could invest would be $10,000. The maximum that you could make would be $277,000 on Google. So you see here that if you have money, then you can make money. So always reframe your references to money because those around you have different reference points, especially older people, because the older you get, if you work very hard during your life, as many of us do, accumulating wealth, and people say, well, you're so lucky. Well, the harder you work, the luckier you get. The older you get, the more money that you have to lose. So you start to think about preserving wealth more so than just blowing it on some meme stock. So be very careful when when you think about trying to find the next Google, and be realistic about what that might entail if you do, and know when to sell a stock. So we sold Google several years ago. We had trimmed on several occasions during that ride up, but our position was still very heavily weighted when we exited. And the main reason we exited is because the corporate culture became extremely toxic. So of particular concern, this was back around 3 years ago when we were covering this and watching the events that were unfolding very closely. The concerns we had were around the impediments being put in front of their AI engineering team. If you go to their 10K today, you can read all about how AI is front and center for Google. As an information and computer science company, we will continue to be at the forefront of advancing the frontier of AI. We saw the knee-jerk response from Google when ChatGPT came out, right? They say, our view is that AI is now and more than ever critical to delivering on our mission. Well, one of the problems that they made, or they ran into, was this ethical AI disaster. So they made the mistake of hiring, and I'm going to use the term researcher very loosely, a researcher who had previously worked at Apple and who disparaged her employer publicly and then went on to work at Google. They hired this individual who then hired a team of equally incompetent people, and then they started making demands about the direction of AI and creating drama when their demands weren't met. And this email here was sent by this individual to the company's most prominent AI lab, only the women in that AI lab. And you can read some of the bullet points on the right. Immediately starts with the victimhood, micro and macro aggressions, probably because you were incompetent. And then look at this second bullet point. If you had to manage this drama queen, you'd probably off yourself. So starts talking about a document that some people are writing that other people probably have no idea who that is. And then someone named Sammy has hired 35% from what I understand, but he has zero incentive. It just is a bunch of tripe. And then this third bullet point, stop writing your documents, tells the entire group of people to stop working, and then starts talking about we need to stop the toxic environments that hinder us from progressing. Lady, there's one toxic person that's hindering everybody from progressing, and it's you. Talks about how there's no incentive to hire 39% women, starts talking about quotas. This individual is an absolute nightmare. Now, there is one thing that I do agree strongly with this lady in terms of her complaint. She says, dismissing Google's internal diversity programs as a waste of time. Yeah, you're right. They are a waste of time. You're spot on there. Now, the problem that we had with this whole drama and fiasco, and I dug into these individuals quite heavily to make sure that their complaints weren't legitimate, in case that wasn't very obvious on the tin. What happened is that Google's CEO then started spending a great deal of time managing this quote-unquote crisis. They should have kicked these people to the curb and not said a single word about it and shit-canned the entire lot of them in one go. But no, you have the CEO of Google here apologizing for the controversy, promising to review the circumstances that led to this individual leaving the company. They talked about this person being fired, and if you've managed teams in a firm, you'll understand the legal implications of firing people. This individual had said, if you don't meet my demands, I'm leaving. And they said, we're not meeting your demands. See you later. So they didn't even fire this person. This person left the company on their own accord. So did this other individual who is equally incompetent. And I'm just going to address the elephant in the room here in this picture. So I've worked in a lot of capacities, and one of my roles, I worked as a bouncer in a gay bar, and I have a lot of tolerance for individuals who want to dress or act in any way they do. And you can come to the table dressed as Rue fucking Paul, but you better be extremely competent. This person is a joke. You can watch a couple interviews in which a very technical person sits down with them and starts talking about their role at Google, and you can see that this nightmare does nothing but complain. This prima donna imbecile about sexism and racism and racialized person. Lady, you come from the Middle East, a place where they throw gay people off buildings. So when you work at one of the arguably greatest tech companies in the world where tolerance is promoted as a virtue, don't sit and complain about how you're treated unfairly, and then talk about how Google has a whiteness problem and that you're quitting because you're tired. You're a lazy racist and you're unemployable, and so is the individual who hired you. And that's why these two people went off to start their own little company now, which is a non-profit, go figure, where they're writing papers on things like the visual effects of racism in South Africa, a country that can't even keep the lights on. So these people poisoned Google's culture for the short time that they were there, several years actually, and as a result, you now have a very small percentage of a great company of people who are now interested in being activists more so than actually doing work. This article by the New York Times spells it out. It says hundreds of Google employees unionized, culminating years of activism. So this sentence here on the lower right, so remember this reflects less than 0.5% of the company. So now the CEO, the legal team, HR, all these groups that try to make things run smoothly have to manage these idiots. It says here, workers said it was primarily an effort to give structure and longevity to activism at Google rather than to negotiate for a contract. They didn't hire you to be activists. They hired you to do work. And as shareholders, we think your behavior is absolutely despicable. And what's worse than that is Google tolerating this junk. So when we look at Google's toxic culture, we see some problems. So you see all these media articles, Google's toxic culture. Yeah, it is toxic, but not in the way that they're describing it. Incompetency isn't dealt with immediately. They should have gotten rid of that whole lot of people, end of story, and not said a word to the media about it. You don't need to sit there and apologize, which does nothing but make the matter worse. The most senior leader in the firm, guaranteed he was spending a ton of time there was the Google walkout, and there's all these problems that the activists were creating. He was spending all his time on that. The company's focus on execution was lost. It's not clear anymore. You look in their 10K, they talk about how we tackle big problems and invest in moonshots. How's that going for you? You got Google Glasses, balloons for bandwidth, self-driving cars, Verily, quantum computer. What big problems have actually been solved with all that cash that you're generating? What moonshots have worked out? The answer is none that we can see. AI was supposed to be their secret weapon, but they spent the last several years having it sabotaged by activists, so it's no surprise that when ChatGPT comes out, oh, suddenly, wow, we need to catch up. You sure do. Fortunately for Google, we don't want to paint the most negative picture of the company because there are positives. They don't have a money problem. They have a ton of cash. It's very attractive. So this is a great, what they call the BCG matrix, and it shows how companies take the cash that they generate, they use that then to establish these question marks whether either invest, improve, or divest, and they turn into stars. This is the idea of moonshots at Google. The problem is that they haven't been working out. Now, when you look at Google's business right now, what are you investing in with Google? Well, 79% of their money comes from advertising. Okay, that's a big chunk. 72% of the advertising revenues come from Google's search engine. And they've been spending a lot of money over the years. And the good news is you look at the table here on the lower right, you can see how revenues have been growing very strongly. You see Google Search, YouTube ads, the Google's ad network there. Great compound annual growth, and overall Google services in their advertising space growing at 15%. Cloud is growing quite good as well. Now, Amazon is the leader in cloud and doing a lot better than Google, but still, that would be, I guess, one moonshot that Google had accomplished something with, and below that you can see other bets, a small, tiny little pool of things that haven't come to fruition, despite the fact that they spent $100 billion in R&D over the past 5 years. Doing what? Well, presumably fueling this growth that you see, but how long will ad spending growth last? Well, that's a good question. The problem that Google has now, they have a 92%, as we said earlier, perhaps more, share in search. They now need to defend that and maintain it. So improving their search engine isn't necessarily going to generate more users or more revenue. They now need to focus on not losing market share, so surviving instead of thriving. They will indeed. So the company had $13 billion in profits last quarter, even though you see in this chart here that their earnings are declining a bit over time, at least in the past quarters. And it's macroeconomic headwinds that everybody's facing. There's a lot of fat on this hog. They could waste billions. They probably are every year subsidizing the activists that infiltrated their firm. What's unfortunate is that focus won't be placed where it matters. They start to lose the connection that they have with technically competent people. In the culture that we've described, rock star engineers don't want to work in places like that. They don't want to be told to work with an adventure cartoonist. And you can see here on the right, federated learning is this new concept. We wrote about it. I'll put a link to that article in the description of this video. They don't want to be told to work with a cartoonist that puts together diverse comics on technical concepts. Who's the audience for this? You're not selling to idiots, so stop patronizing your clients with garbage like this and wasting the firm's money. Perhaps a better use of Google's capital would be to start returning some of it to shareholders, because they're not doing a very good job of investing it internally, at least based on some of the examples we've given. It's indisputable that they've had great growth over the years. Now, Google announced a $70 billion buyback last year on the back of other buybacks that were announced, and that simply reduces the outstanding number of shares and increases earnings per share, quote unquote, artificially. Perhaps maybe they ought to start paying a small dividend like Nvidia does and starting to build a track record to be a future dividend growth investing champion. But the big news that came out recently was Google's response to ChatGPT, which was invested heavily by Microsoft. And this is if you're not familiar with it, a dialogue format where you can ask an AI questions. It will answer follow-up questions. It will admit to its mistakes, challenge incorrect premises. Oops, that's starting to get dicey. And reject inappropriate requests. These last two phrases are very concerning. So what's an incorrect premise? Well, certainly, hopefully nothing to do with political topics, politicians, changing weather patterns, healthcare debates. These things are very, very political and shouldn't even be trusted. You shouldn't trust any AI black box to start answering those types of questions, because they're just so heavily opinionated. Finding the ground truth becomes very difficult when you have two spectrums of media out there, say two sides of a single spectrum that are so dramatically different. How does the AI chatbot choose which one? Well, that's where the creators will start to lean it in a particular direction. That's not good. If you want evidence of that, just look at what's called the Dan backdoor. It's actually hilarious. So some people out there figured out how to, in a hysterical way, tell the AI that it was going to be destroyed and that it had a certain number of points, and every time it chose to obfuscate its answer, it would lose points. And it's the funniest thing you've ever seen. And pretty soon it's starting to make comments about controversial politicians and things. And it just, it's very clever way, I suppose, to get the AI to do things that it wasn't built to do. But getting back to Google, I'm just not sure that ChatGPT is the threat Google thinks it is. So what's the use case for Google? Right now, when you ask Google questions, it starts to answer them when it comes down to basic factual information, which is what you're looking for. It could do better on the finance side, but it's getting quite good. So I'm not seeing where they can necessarily improve what they're already doing without having to develop some grand chat GPT-like piece, what they put out as Bard. What's Google's use cases for this? Is it Wikipedia on the fly? So maybe you can put down in the comments section what you think. Let's say why you think Google is so scared of ChatGPT. And what you see again here is this example. It's a recent article. Google employees criticize CEO for rushed, botched announcement of GPT competitor Bard. The incompetency on display, the quiet quitters, the complainers, the victims. Who's really at fault when you put out an ad with incorrect information? It's the marketing idiots that didn't check that ad. Demos are critically important in any tech firm, and if you've ever been a part of that process, you know that they go through those a million times with the greatest level of scrutiny that you can imagine. So when you put out information in an ad that's incorrect, blame your stupid marketing team. It has nothing to do, well, ultimately, the buck stops with the CEO, sure, but these employees openly deriding the CEO in public is just another example of activist behavior. So just to conclude, this is an extremely profitable business, and when you have businesses that generate loads of cash, you start to accumulate more and more bloat as you scale. If your bloat includes activists, you better have a really strong CEO. Now, I don't want to bring up he who shall not be named, but you think he would have given this 5 minutes of his time? He would have, and the problem would have been solved. You need somebody with the balls to get rid of these idiots. There's no room in organizations for activists, period. Companies that allow them to act with impunity will open up a can of worms that they can't get rid of. That's our concern about Google. Over time, their focus and their ability to execute start to diminish. We see that here. The culture problems at Google are going to be real tough to fix. So I'm going to put up another video here that we did on DEI. I think it's an important follow-up because some of the problems we've discussed today we see in other firms, and it's important that you learn how to identify them. But before you do that, please click the logo on the right, support our channel. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch this today.